our guest tonight, Lis Wiehl, has quite the resume. She's a former federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, law professor at the University of Washington, legal analyst, and reporter on Fox News, NBC News, and NPR's All Things Considered. She's a regular commentator for CNN and the author of over 19 books. I don't know where she finds the time. In A Spy in Plain Sight, she digs into the worst intelligence disaster in U.S. history. And here to ask the hard-hitting questions about this book is her good friend and R.J. Julia's own, Laura Jackson.
The hard-hitting question.
I love that. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that Julie did your list of accomplishments. I had to make a cheat sheet of it because even though I've known you for a while, you have a very impressive resume.
I just can't keep a job.
You have many jobs, but it also makes you the perfect person to be writing these books because you have a background in fiction and you also really know the topic that you're talking about because among other things you've been a federal prosecutor and you are also the daughter of an FBI agent, and so when you approach these issues you do so with great understanding and I don't know if sympathy is the right word, but I mean but care. You take care with your subjects and you make sure that you are fair and well researched.
Definitely well researched, and I try to be fair.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I bring to this, besides being your
Being
friend,
my
and
friend.
enjoying your books, is that when I first came to R.J. Julia, they said, "Oh, is there anything you don't read?" And I said, "Why, yes, I don't read I don't
True
read
crime.
nonfiction or true crime." And you changed all that, Lis.
Good.
Yeah,
Well, I'm
so-
glad to broaden your horizons.
Yeah, you're welcome. So this is the third in a grouping of 3 books that you wrote.
Right.
Do you want to?
All about these bad guys. The first one was about Charles Manson, hunting Charles Manson, and the second one was hunting the Unabomber. And because nobody would know Robert Hanssen's name, we couldn't say hunting Robert Hanssen. So we had to come up with a different title. But yeah, it's all the same idea of really researching and getting to an understanding of who these people are and were and the people around them and why it happened and can we protect ourselves from something like a Manson, a Unabomber, or a Hanssen happening again. Because I think that writing sort of historical nonfiction is important to tell the story of the person you're writing about, but it's just as important, even more important, to be relevant to today. You know, why is history relevant to today? You know, my kids asked when I was writing about the first bad guy, Manson, you know, why would you write about Manson? Why would you write another book about Manson? You know, it's enough. So, but we need to understand what really happened and why he was able to lure these people into this family so that it doesn't happen again. And sure enough, there was a prosecution out in New York just a couple of years ago. Keith Rainier and Nexium, you may have heard about that. He used Manson's playbook. So the more that we learn about history, the more hopefully we can protect ourselves from things happening again, just the same way.
I think in this one in particular, I mean, all of them, but in this one I really noticed that you told us about Hanssen himself, and then the circles got bigger. I mean, we learned about the FBI, we learned about who spies in general, we learned about, you know, the Soviet Union / Russia, because the difference between the two comes into play. I've lost my train of thought. But it just the ripples
There
that went out.
absolutely are ripples, yes.
And I think coming through all of your books, I've gained a greater understanding of just how the different federal agencies work in general and together, and that's been
Or
kind of
don't.
a theme. Or don't. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, the problem, you know, with Hanssen in particular is that the FBI at a certain point realized, because they were losing all their Russian assets, the people that were in place that for the FBI had recruited in Russia, they were losing them, they were being executed. So we didn't have any intel. And they began to realize over the years, and this is a course of 20 years that he was spying, that there was a mole. But because the FBI is the way that it is, it's a very built on trust institution. Once you're in, once you pass the background, then you're in and you're trusted. And there's a good part of that. You know, it's like being police officers. You're out there, you gotta trust your partner, you gotta trust them with all the intelligence. when you're arresting people, you gotta know that the man or woman right beside you is trustworthy. So that emanated out, and Hanssen was protected by that because of that trust culture in the FBI. And I would say one of the things that the FBI certainly learned in this is that, trust but verify, because here was this man all along using them and using everything he got from them to sell it to the Russians. So.
And so for the people who haven't read the book, can you give kind of a little overview and just who Robert Hanssen is?
Sure.
Yeah.
He's still alive. He grew up in Chicago, fairly middle class family. His father was a police officer. His father was fairly brutal to him. I outlined some scenes here in the book where his father did some pretty, I think we would call abusive things to him. And he grew up though wanting to sort of emulate his father. He was an accountant by training, and then he got into the FBI. And for him to get into the FBI really kind of showed it to his father, right? That he could do this, he could accomplish it, to be in what is one of the best intelligence agencies in the world, really. And I do say that with some pride, because my dad was an FBI agent and one of the really good ones, and most of them are. And anyway, he got into the FBI, and within less than a year of being in the FBI and put in counter-espionage, he eventually rose to the highest levels of counter-espionage in the Russian department, sent a letter to whom we become his Russian handler, saying, I have this intel. He didn't say who he was. Russians never found out who he was, actually. But I have this intel, you can check it, and this is going to be good information for you. And that started the ball rolling. Here's a guy who, reached out to the Russians himself. He wasn't turned, he wasn't flipped, he wasn't anything like that. He reached out and started that process with them. And it took all, 20 years of this where he gave over the assets, our assets, people that were on the ground, that were executed because of what he did. And I go into that quite a bit in the book. And our secrets. Imagine the guy at the top level of the espionage unit of the FBI for 20 years, he's going to have some secrets, including nuclear plans and other things like that. I asked for an estimation of the amount of damage, if you could put it into dollars, and the FBI agents told me they estimated probably about $10 billion. And that's back, now remember, he was arrested in 2001, so that's back dollars. But for me, it's not really a dollar amount kind of thing. People died because of what he did. So he was able to continue this. There were some puffs of smoke, as I call them in the book.
It's an interesting, you mentioned that throughout, and it really adds, because you're talking about what it took to build this case.
Right, and even before building the case, the puffs of smoke were, for example, his wife Bonnie looked into a sock drawer early on in his spying, and saw all this cash. And so she confronts Hanssen and says, is this some money for you're having an affair with somebody? Because he was wont to do that. Is this, the money you're spending on your mistress? And she says, no, I'm not cheating on you. I'm just spying for the Russians. And Bonnie, they're good Catholics to the outer world, good Catholics, devout, Opus Dei, Mass every day. So they went to their priest, and the priest said, spying for Russia, not good, shouldn't be doing that. But if you stop it and you pay the money to the church that you've already gained from the Russians, you're absolved. Now, I'm not Catholic, but it just doesn't seem like that should be kosher. So that's what happened. Bonnie then, her fears were, allayed, and we don't know whether she really knew any more about his spying, continuous spying. He stopped for a little bit after the priest encounter, and then started back up again. So.
And that brings up a really interesting theme about his morality and how he saw himself. Well, because in some ways he comes off as this incredibly moral guy.
Right. That was the portrayal.
Yeah, and I'm just so curious. I mean, you can't. What did he believe? I mean, I just sort of wonder sometimes.
What he said he believed was...
Or did he, I mean, you talk about compartmentalization in the book, but there's a possibility that this guy really believed he was either above it, or, I mean, if you could just talk about what made him unique, because I think it feeds into how he became this person.
He said he believed to everyone who would listen, and he would, you know, sermonize at them, devout Catholic, I mean, Opus Dei, which is a whole other, you know, it's a very devout sect of the Catholicism. And he hated the Russians, he said. They said they were godless people, called them commies. I mean, he was, after all, in the anti-espionage, you know, section of the Russian Department of the FBI. And that's the man that he portrayed, happily married, 5 children, all in private school, living in Scarsdale. One wonders that the FBI didn't raise an eyebrow about that, living on an FBI salary, he could afford to live in a nice house in Scarsdale and send 5 kids to private school. But I digress. But that was the outer world that he gave. Internally, I spoke with his psychiatrist, who interviewed him for weeks and months after his arrest. And he believes, and I think it's right, that Hanssen thought in some warped way, and you have to think like a criminal, you can't think like us all, you have to think like a criminal to get in their mind, that by giving over to Russia these secrets, he would somehow make our country better, because we would have to be a better country to shore up any of the holes that the Russians were now poking. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You have to follow this kind of warped logic, but I think that's what he told himself, because he knew that the information he was giving over was getting people killed. I mean, he was also motivated by money.
Yeah,
He got
yeah.
money for this.
Yeah.
He was disgruntled. He was a disgruntled employee. He thought that his colleagues didn't like him much, which they didn't for the most part. He was kind of dour and, you know, didn't want to join any of the festivities, and, you know, just always a computer nerd guy. And that was great at the time, because they needed somebody to come in and really revitalize the computerization at the FBI, which is still to this day really lags. But, and he always had to be the smartest guy in the room. So he was disgruntled, had to be the smartest guy in the room, was looking for love, and the Russians gave it to him. And the letters between them,
Oh, yeah, the letters are
Are
fascinating. There's a lot
flowery.
of letters in there, and they just play to his sense of self remarkably.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. But the technology is an interesting thought, because one of the ways he really felt that he was better, and in fact, he did know more than the average other agents, but the use of technology and the fact that it was new.
Right. For the FBI, it wasn't all
Yeah.
that new. But the FBI, I mean, I remember, this is a side note, but when I was a federal prosecutor working with FBI agents, every time they do an interview, they have to type up what's called a 302, which is the report of that interview. And, you know, as a prosecutor, waiting to get those things in. And I had agent after agent say to me, well, it'll take a couple weeks, because we've got to send them out to Minnesota, where everything gets typed up by the secretarial pool. And I'm like, we're doing a murder investigation. I don't have time for wait 2 weeks for your darn 302. I said it not as nicely as I'm saying it now. But it was ridiculous. And of course, I didn't stand for that, so they would just have to come and tell me what they wrote, or just give me their notes. I would take that. But that was just an example of, you know, this is now post Stephen Hanssen, where the computerization is just slow in the FBI. It's not something that they focus on. I mean, they are focused on, after all, espionage and getting the bad guys and, you know, federal crimes, obviously, and so they're busy with all that. And they let Hanssen just kind of, you know, you can handle the computerization. To a point, I'll even say one of the puffs of smoke was, at one point, he hacks into one of his colleagues' computers at the FBI, and they catch him. And they say to him, you know, you just hacked into, you know, Joe Agent's computer. Well, I did that, said Hanssen, because I was showing you by doing that how easily we're hacked, and therefore we can get better at it. Not being hacked, that is. And he got away with it. So,
Another major puff of smoke was his brother-in-law.
his brother-in-law, Mark Walk, yeah.
If you want to,
Yeah.
yeah.
So along the way, Mark Walk, his brother-in-law, who was also in the FBI, and I interviewed at great length, Mark was very helpful, said that he'd heard about Bonnie and the cash. he heard Bonnie say that Bob was talking about retiring to Poland. This is in the middle of the Cold War. For an FBI agent to say that, it's very strange. And at some point, they knew that they had a mole. They just didn't know from where the mole was coming. And so Mark Walk went to his supervisor, a guy named Lyle, and said to him, this is where the stories diverge, because the supervisor said, no, I didn't really finger Robert Hanssen, but Mark Walk says, yeah, I did. So I don't know who's covering whose rear here, but, you know, there was a report made and no follow-up done on it. So you got him hacking into computers, you got reports of him with all this cash and talking about, you know, retiring to Poland, very strange, and they're at this point, they know there's a mole, they just don't know where the mole is, because their assets are dying. And there's no other way that would happen unless somebody from the inside was leaking that information to the Russians.
And inside is defined kind of interestingly here, because they were not looking inside, in a way.
When they started the hunt.
Yeah.
No, they weren't. They were looking at they looked at a CIA officer, Brian Kelly. And he's now no longer with us, Brian isn't, but I spoke with his widow, Patricia, who said the FBI fingering her husband to be the spy of the century, and by the way, this was all front page news, not just in this country, but internationally, you know, basically killed him. I mean, the stress, the horror of it, the idea that, you know, this could be him, and he knew he wasn't part of it. But they got the wrong guy, and they held on to that. They really thought this was the guy. And in fact, the way they finally got to Hanssen was through a Russian asset that they'd approached to get the information, more information about Brian Kelly. And it turned out when they gave that information over to us, and it was a tape recording where you could hear a voice speaking to the Russians, it wasn't Brian Kelly's voice, it was Robert Hanssen's voice. And it took them a while even to get that, because they weren't looking for him. They weren't thinking about him as a suspect. And so they didn't look internally. And, you know, famously people say mistakes were made.
They wanted it to be CIA.
They wanted
so
to be
badly.
CIA,
Yeah.
because that would make them look bad. And, you know, it's all this sort of fiefdoms, and, you know, we were talking about agencies before. I mean, that's the problem with a lot of governmental agencies, is each has their, you know, their turf, and they'll be darned if anybody's gonna come over and, you know, walk into their turf or take their turf. So, Hanssen played on that. And when they were searching for the mole, Hanssen, being the computer guru, knew who they were searching for, what search engines they were using, what they were doing. He was tracking the whole thing. I mean,
He had incredible access.
and incredible access that he misused, abused, everything.
Yeah. You talk a little bit about his love of like James Bond.
Yes.
And so forth, and this seems to be part of what made him
Another
tick, too.
motivation, yes,
Yeah.
aside from money, aside from being disgruntled, is his oldest friend, a guy named Jack Hausschauer, told me that when they were kids, that Hanssen loved everything about James Bond allure, the saving the damsel in distress, the gadgets, looking cool, all of that kind of stuff. And that he really kind of fashioned himself as a James Bond character, but in reality, he looked and acted nothing like James Bond, you know, I mean, nobody really liked this guy. But I think that was a big part of it, and the Russians played into that, you know, Arctic Friend, and you know, all of this stuff. So that was definitely another motivator to keep going.
And kind of the excitement. I
Yeah.
mean, I think there was
Yeah,
kind of a rush that he
absolutely.
got
And
from the whole thing.
what was frightening to me as I was learning all this about his character and why and the motivation is that while it's peculiar to this one man, Robert Hanssen, these aren't peculiar attributes to any one person, right? I mean, disgruntled employee, someone who thinks they're smarter than anyone else in the room, someone who needs to be loved, and is not getting it from his colleagues or from wherever, who needs money. I mean, that's kind of generic, which is, you know, I mean, I wish I'd found something that, you know, he loves water, he loves water with only, you know, green has to have that. I mean, okay, great, that would be something, you know, a little different, but it was just kind of a generic motivations here.
Yeah.
that could be applied in a lot of different agencies where people have power.
And what set him off would not set somebody else off.
Right.
I mean, that's
Right.
another interesting thing about the brother-in-law, is that they have so many things in common, and yet one guy was straight as an arrow and even tried to turn his own brother-in-law
Try
in.
to turn him in.
Yeah, and said, God, this guy is worrying me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's like with the Unabomber, it was the brother that turned in
Yeah,
the
that's
Unabomber
right.
in the end,
Yeah,
so.
I need it. The money's almost comic relief in some ways. I mean, except there's no comic relief here, let me make
No,
that clear.
no.
But, I mean, the money in the sock drawer was not
Right.
unusual.
Right, and Bonnie, his wife, was told to spend, money in cash and just to get the groceries in cash, and they were a cash household because, of course, that if you take anything more than $10,000 to the bank, you're gonna trip off all sorts of reporting requirements, so we didn't do that. He just spent the cash, but we paid that Russian asset who finally gave us the tape, and I confirm that, $7 million. And Hanssen got nowhere near that during all of his years of spying.
But he still didn't know how to handle the money. He's like, he's got this money, and he's like, oh my God, what do I do with
He
that?
didn't know what to do with
He's
it,
like,
right.
little stashes here
Right,
and there.
he got some diamonds, he may have given to a girlfriend,
Yeah.
and, I don't know. He didn't get rich off it.
He paid a lot of parochial school tuition.
Lot of parochial school tuition,
And I'm just
that kind of
wondering
thing.
if he went and said, hey, I'd like to pay tuition in cash this year.
I think he
He
did, I
must
think
have.
he paid everything in
Yeah.
cash, yeah.
Yeah.
Which again was kind of odd for an FBI agent, And if they had done another background check or financial disclosure on him in those 20 years, or a polygraph, going back to my days as a federal prosecutor, I knew any day, I stopped eating poppy seed bagels. You know why? You know why. Drug guys up here in front. Because poppy seed bagels can show up on your analysis as
Opiates.
is it opiates? Yeah. See, I forget, because now I eat poppy seed bagels. But I didn't eat them, and because I knew any day I walked in, I could be, subject to urinalysis, polygraph. In the 5th year of being a federal prosecutor, they redid my complete background check, because things can happen in 5 years. You may not be subject to blackmail when you first start, but things happen in your life, or you need money or whatever, and you could be subject, to it then. So none of that was done for Hanssen in those 20 years. And I try to make the point here that some of those things are being done now, they're being done better, but they can't be slapdash, done. They've got to be really done. You're going to do a real security clearance. You're going to do a real financial background check. You're really going to enforce polygraphs and urinalysis and all of that kind of stuff. And you have to have those safeguards in place.
Because hindsight is 20/20.
Sure.
But with hindsight,
You make
there
changes.
are a couple serious little loopholes that, he never got a polygraph, for example,
Right.
and everybody around him did.
Right. He was just able to skate through that,
He would
Nobody-
wander through people's offices.
taking things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was fairly
I mean,
random.
he copied, this was not high-tech spying. He copied stuff on the Xerox machine outside his office and just stuffed them in his briefcase and went home. Gave it to the Russians. Now you can just put something on the thumbnail drive or send it to the cloud, and you can walk out of there and nobody's the wiser. So, this was not high-tech, James Bondian type spying here, by any means.
It also gave me a lot of, to think about, with the Russians and kind of that distinction he was making between Russians and Soviet Union and Putin's Russia, and just kind of the role that the Cold War played and may still be playing.
I think may still be playing, because, and this gets to what started with me as a just kind of throwaway line in my interviews. The last question I asked in all of my interviews with CIA operatives, past and present, FBI, past and present, could there be another Hanssen today? And 100% of them said yes, and many of them followed, unprompted by me, saying, and there probably already is. You think about, that's scary enough just when when Russia isn't at war with Ukraine, but right now, we need intel. We need to know what the Russians are doing. And diplomacy and politicians and all that is great, we've got certain information that way, but we've always relied on assets, whether in China, North Korea, Russia, wherever, to give us that intel. And if we don't have it, or in fact we have somebody that's working against us on our side, I mean, that's a really chilling kind of thing to contemplate right now, especially where we are in the world.
Oh, absolutely. So what kind of takeaway do you, I mean, did you want people to take, I mean, that's kind of a good takeaway right
Yeah.
there, but is there anything else that really you would want people to think a little more about after reading this?
I mean, I guess a couple of things that we've covered really are thematic, which is that, you know, these motivations, because everyone wants to know motivation, right? As a prosecutor, when you prosecute a crime, you don't have to prove motive, but you always do, because the jurors want it. The jurors want to know why, you know, why would a person do this? You know, try to get into their head. And the motivations that we've outlined, we've talked about, kind of generic, and that's scary, because it's not just this one weird guy. It can be, you know, any one of us being happy with our employees, needing to feel more loved, you know, all of that, needing the thrill, needing money. So the motivations, and this idea, again, I had no idea when I started asking that question about could there be another Hanssen today, that it would be such a universal response. I mean, one of the agents said to me something like, will there be another bank robbery? Will there be another fraud case? Of course, people are gonna commit crimes. People are gonna be motivated by weird things. People are gonna do it. They're gonna push and cross over that boundary. Of course, we're gonna have another spy in the FBI. Just very matter of fact.
Yeah.
That was shocking to me, and I think as a citizen, you know, that we need to keep putting pressure on our agencies to make sure, hey, we know this happened, we know the Hanssen story, we know what all these people said, we want to make sure that you're doing your job. And because, you know, 99.9 of them are, you know, like my dad and the other agents that I worked with, great people who really went into it with absolutely the most stellar of motivations, just to keep us all safe. And that's what they're doing, but it's a couple, you know, it's a bad apple like this that put a bad mark on the agency and, you know, make us trust it less, and the FBI's gone through some hard years these last few years, make it trust it less, so they need to do their job so that that trust can be reinforced and well placed.
It's interesting for me as a primarily fiction reader to see how you were still able to fashion this in a very readable way that kind of picks up speed as the puffs of smoke kind of finally begin to congeal and show.
Well, nobody wants to read a history lesson. I mean, I should say
Yeah.
nobody, but I'm a fiction writer as well. Most of my books have been fiction. And I like things to move and for you to feel some excitement and some thrill. And this is a thrilling story, you know, so
Yeah.
I just needed to write it in a way
Well,
that,
and you did, because
Thank
you
you.
know, you're layering all the discoveries, and then the last two chapters are like boom, boom, boom. So you still get that kind of
thrill
rush
rest.
that you would
Yeah.
get.
Yeah, the rush at the
You
end of
get
a
the rush.
fiction book too.
But then if you look at the end, I was thinking, oh gosh, I have a lot left to read, and I'm gonna be doing this soon, and then I'm like, oh, look, footnotes.
Yeah, the
But, you know, it's
footnotes go on
incredibly
for-
well researched,
oh
but
my
it
gosh,
doesn't
50
need, you're not
pages.
stuck, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
Like,
you can
as a
read them at the
reader-
end, just so you know that I'm not making this stuff up.
No, but it's, I mean, and I know you, I know how hard you work, and I know how much research you put in, and I know how you find a lot of people to interview. And so, when you started out, did you know that you were gonna get to be able to talk to all these people?
No, I started out right before the pandemic hit, and then I wrote during the pandemic. And so more people were available and home. And so that was great. Also, being the daughter of an FBI agent and having been a former prosecutor myself, and a journalist, these people are likely to hang up if you lead with, I'm a journalist, but if you lead with, and my father, Richard Wiehl, worked in about the same time you did. You know, they can look him up, and they did, and I was a federal prosecutor. It's really gauche then to hang up the phone, not talk to me. You know, it's just, we're all part of the federal, remember what I was saying about trust when you're in the federal family? There is that feeling of being in the federal family, you're in there, you know what each other goes through because you've been there, you've been on the streets, you've done it. And I had, and my dad had, And so it was, once I got a few of the top interviews, they led me to other people. And that's just a dream for a journalist to have it work like that. Not the pandemic, but it did make it easier to do the Zoom calls and things like that with these people.
More? Yeah, sure, it's just, I don't have a watch on, but, so, we can open up to.
Questions,
to
yeah,
questions
yeah,
and
let's hear from
comments.
folks. Yes, Mister.
What, I'm vaguely remembering, wasn't there another sort of big spy case that kind of overlapped this? I want to say the name's Angle.
The Ames. Ames case, yeah.
Yeah.
And there was Ames, there was Pitts, they're all, there's a picture of them here somewhere in the middle. I've got them all lined up. Yeah, Aldrich, Rick Ames, Edwin Pitts, right here, and Hanssen, so they're all on one page.
Is he CIA or Navy?
CIA.
CIA.
So it was, that's, again, the CIA, to be fair to the FBI, had more of the spies than had the FBI. And the FBI was in charge of the investigation.
Yeah.
So, human nature being what it is, they looked first and foremost, and they created this, they put people in what they call the vault, and I call them the vault people here in a chapter, where, because it was just kind of in a basement, no windows or anything, and these people created a matrix to try to figure out where the mole was coming from. You know, taking all of the people that would have had access and then tying those up with the cases that they had and the Russian assets that were killed or the secrets that were released, and came up with a matrix and names of people. Hanssen was never put into the matrix. That was stunning to me. He was never even in there. Brian Kelly, the CIA agent who was targeted and called a spy, was. But Hanssen never even made it into the matrix.
Because it wasn't operational, probably.
Well, he was operational. I mean, it wasn't just computers. He was operational. He knew everything, but he just didn't make it. He just didn't make it in. A mistake.
Where is Hanssen now, and has he ever indicated any remorse or given any sort of explanation for his actions?
He is in Florence, Colorado, in a Supermax facility
For life, I hope.
for life, no chance of parole. Our government took execution off the table in exchange for his telling them everything. I'm not sure that he did, but telling them he was debriefed for hours and hours and days, as well as his wife. And so he's there now, 23 hours a day, solitary confinement, and he's hanging out with the Unabomber, I guess, in his other hours. That's where the Unabomber is too. And per his plea agreement, he can't talk to anybody. So he wouldn't talk to me, nor would his wife. She can't either. She's still getting a pension from the government. We're paying for that. Yes.
Why wasn't she ever prosecuted? I mean, it's just so telling, her story. Like,
Yeah.
she definitely had a lot of involvement in this, and it's befuddling to me that she was never apparently prosecuted.
You know, she was told there at the beginning, and then this priest told her what to do, so I guess, I mean, she still could have been prosecuted for that. And then there was never any real evidence that she knew after that he continued to spy. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of marriages where one spouse doesn't really want to admit to themselves what the other person is doing, right? So if we are kind to her, that's the judgment I would impose upon her, is that she may or may not have known, but maybe she just didn't want to think about it and looked the other way. I mean, she was spending all this money in cash. I mean, why? You know, you got a paycheck. So, but I think they just thought that after they got Hanssen, they debriefed Lonnie. She was no danger to anybody at that point.
Does that feed back into the whole FBI family? Maybe
Yeah,
that they were gonna take care of her a little bit?
Maybe, although they certainly weren't family at that point.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
How did he actually pass the information? Did he meet with Russian agents in person? And secondly, what exact information did he release?
He never met with them in person. In fact, when it was discovered and the headlines were that this is the spy, I think the Russians were just as surprised as anyone else, because they never knew the identity of the person they were working with. And Hanssen, of course, kept it that way. He didn't want them knowing who he was. So they never knew. And you had a second part to your question, I'm sorry.
I think you said how.
What information?
Yeah, what,
How did
How did it transpire? Okay, so again, very low tech. he would send these letters out to the Russians and say, you know, I'm gonna make a drop on X day, and he picked a park, like an Ottaway Park near his house, or different parks in Washington or New York area. And they would mix it up, but some days he would put a vertical strip of white tape across a tree that they had decided on. That meant the drop had been placed. And so then when the Russians picked it up and put their drop for the money, they changed it from vertical to horizontal. Vertical, horizontal, get my stuff right here, yeah, I had horizontal, vertical. And so that's how how they would do it. And in fact, even on his last drop, when he was the sting operation had already started, the FBI was following him, that's exactly what he did to make his last drop. And when they caught him after the sting operation to set him up, he said, "What took you so long?" Right? I mean, still.
But
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes, in the back.
How could they believe that the Russians never knew who he was? If he was sending them a letter saying, I'm going to drop here on such a date and time, they certainly must have had people there watching.
I don't think so. I don't think so. And it wasn't as close as to exactly the time, so they would have to be there for a while. I really don't think they knew who he was. They certainly acted surprised when it was, shown to be Hanssen. I don't think they did. I really don't. And he was very careful about that. They didn't want to ruin a good thing either. Hanssen was smart too. If he thought he was being watched, he might never do it again. And the intel that they were getting from him consistently was so good and so damaging for us that they weren't going to try anything to mess that up. They had this golden goose, they're laying these golden eggs. They weren't going to mess that up. Yes.
You've mentioned the generic motivations that.
I think they're generic,
Okay,
kind of.
sure, I
Yeah.
agree. But you mentioned that it started, the first letter he wrote was after a year at work. Normally, it takes most of us more than a year to be
To get
dissatisfied.
disgruntled?
Or disgruntled.
Right.
And all that. So it seems like there might have been something else in his background growing up or something that led him to dislike America or something. Did you see any of that at all?
No, father, like I said, Chicago cop, wanted his son to getting into the FBI was sort of the pinnacle of anything that could possibly happen to this guy in his father's eyes. And at least he professed, loving this country and hating the Russians. Now, of course, that wasn't what he was doing.
But again,
But-
in one year after he started his job, all
Yeah.
of a sudden to start doing this, he just seems so interesting.
Well, when you talk about what he told his wife
Right.
after that first time, that
Right.
he didn't believe he was doing harm.
He didn't.
The first time.
He didn't. I mean, that Dr. Charney gave me this really nugget of, he thought he was doing something good for this country by giving to the Russians its information. Therefore, we would realize where our weaknesses were. I mean, even my saying it's so warped, I can't
Yeah.
follow that. But I get it from a psychological perspective. I get it. And Laura and I were talking about this earlier. You really have to think like a criminal to try to unravel a motivation for somebody like this, or for any criminal, because we don't normally put ourselves in those shoes. And when I was a prosecutor, to be effective and to catch the bad guys, I had to really think like them and try to understand them, because that gave me an insight into who they were and why they did it. It's a weird world.
And at one point you talk about compartmentalization.
Yes. Yeah, he was able to compartmentalize. I mean, like a lot of sociopaths do, if you want to call them that. He was able to compartmentalize what he was doing for the Russians, and then, being out with the family and showing this great, love of God and church and country and all that, when he was doing this on the other side. But he was being fed by that. He was being, I can't underestimate for you how important that is to some people. I mean, it's like I said, why people joined Charles Manson and stayed with him. Tex Watson, at his last parole hearing that I was at, Tex Watson is the guy that actually did the murders. said, Charlie just gave us love. We just felt like a family. And his echo of that when I was doing this book, it's just like, he was unhappy and thought he wasn't being treated as the smartest guy, and here the Russians were giving him all of that, embracing him into their family, saying how brilliant he was. Ate it up. They played him.
Yeah,
They
and the
played
letters, I
him.
mean, you have great letters in
And the
there.
letters are just like
Yeah.
sophomoric and love almost, you know?
They're fascinating.
Yeah.
You had another question over there.
Yes. They're ready.
Yeah, just a question. In the beginning of your career, as you came out of law school, did you clerk or a judge at any point?
I'll be honest and tell you that when I graduated, a lot of my colleagues were, but I had a lot of loans, and I was eager just to get going and just to start work. And so, no, I didn't clerk.
And just to follow up on it, how serious do you think is what happened last evening, where apparently a clerk leaked something to the media, which transforms the Supreme Court into being co-equal with the other branches of government, where people do this for their own purposes?
It's, when I read that last night, I mean, do you know that it was a clerk? I mean, I know that
No,
Alito
there's
is,
the surmise is that it wasn't, unless you think it was, you know.
I mean, that's what makes the most sense. That's what I would have, that would been my first go-to, or
Unless
the
you think
clerks.
Breyer was doing it, just as he's going out the door, but.
But when I read that last night about that leak, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I thought, I can never recall a leak from the Supreme Court. And I think that's borne true today when people have been researching this. I don't think there has been a leak on any case, let alone a case of such incredible import. However you feel about the decision when it comes down, the leak itself, I think we can all agree, is wrong and a horrible betrayal, whoever did that. And yeah, I probably would look at the clerks and the secretaries and the paralegals, you know, that are working on the drafts first.
Yeah.
That's where I would start my
It's
investigation.
sort of interesting because it's this Machiavellian behavior that we see elsewhere in the government, where people feel that they're on the right side of an issue and try to influence that issue in the modern age that we have with communication.
And which side, you know, is it somebody that's saying, well, if I leak this, the American public, now 70% of the American public doesn't want Roe v. Wade to be overturned, so maybe that'll get people so riled up that the justices will change their mind and they want that outcome? Or are they so excited about this coming out and just really want to get it to us? And, you know.
Or did they want to just change the narrative in the public domain?
I don't know. I mean, we'll be finding out in the coming days. It's interesting. We were talking about it right before. It's just, it really sickens me. Again, whatever you think about the decision, the fact that somebody leaked it, a draft, I mean, in the first hours this morning, I was even thinking it could be a hoax. I mean, it might be, but then Roberts came out with a statement saying, no, this is real and I'm starting an investigation.
Is it criminal?
Awful.
Is it criminal to leak it?
Good question. It is not criminal for Politico and the journalists to publish leaked information, as long as they know that it's, you know, real and the sources are good. Think Watergate, right? It's not illegal for the journalists. But it probably, most likely, don't have the statute on the tip of my tongue, but I can think of some, is illegal for the clerks. And let me follow that, if it were a clerk, for example, let me follow that strain of thinking there for a second. Now there'll be an investigation, and those clerks will be brought in, and they will be working, you know, the FBI will interrogate them. And if the person that they ask, the leaker, says, no, I didn't leak, no, I didn't do this, that's an obstruction of justice, 1001, you're looking at 5 years in prison, just for that. So this isn't gonna stop just today. There will be an investigation. And whoever it is looking at, you know, some serious consequences. Yes?
What happened to Hanson's kids?
5 kids, all grown up. One is a professor at a Midwestern school. I'm not sure about the others. I mean, I think they stay pretty much under the radar. Bonnie is still married to Hanssen, goes and visits him. I think she's the only one that does. None of his other colleagues do, for obvious reasons. Jack Helschauer, his best friend, hasn't gone, though he still calls him his best friend. But yeah, Bonnie's with him, and I think the kids are all fine and trying to kind of, get married and use other names. Yeah. Yes.
Women of the
Yes.
UN.
Do you think if there was like, whether that be another like spy right now in the FBI, it could take about 20 years to like find them?
I hope not. I hope not. I hope, but, I mean, I'm serious. I hope even by having discussions like this, and talking about it, that the public can put pressure on agencies like the FBI. Our politicians can put pressure on them through us, so, but if we don't know, this is again why I like to write history books, in the sense that we don't want those lessons, we don't want that to repeat. And if we don't know about Hanssen, we don't know how he got away, we don't know that he was a polygraph, did all of those kinds of things didn't happen, well, now we know. So we have, knowledge is power, right? And we can pressure publicly, hey FBI, make sure you're doing this. Make sure when you do a background check, because there's background checks and background checks that just slough off, ask a few questions and they're on. No, really do one. Really do one. Because I'm convinced if they had, they would have seen the cash spending, the girlfriend, they would have seen, they would have listened to Mark Block, the brother-in-law, they would have at least done something about it. And by the way, at that time, there was no mechanism within the FBI to self-report. So if you saw something, you say something, there was nowhere to go. There wasn't like a Dropbox, here, put your complaints in here, put your spy thoughts in here. Nothing. There wasn't anything like that. After Hanssen, there was a unit that was set up to do that, and President Trump got rid of that. So kind of back to where we were before. But that could be reinstituted, right? There should be a watchdog within the FBI. These men and women hold, some of our most secret and dearest national security, information that can ruin lives. And that's putting it mildly.
And I would once again say this is such a sweet spot between a story that really moves and just really learning something about what happens in this country. So if you haven't bought it yet,
Yeah,
I encourage you to
I
buy it.
tried
There you
to,
go.
again, tried to make it, because I am
very
a fiction
readable.
writer,
Yeah.
to make it short chapters, moves along. I interviewed all these people, not to just to have their words fall on the floor, but to put them in the book. So I parsed and used as much as I could of actual people talking about what happened, people that were there. And I'm in the background, I'm just the vessel giving this information to you.
You did
Yes.
very well.
Thank you.
Maybe which, is the FBI or any government agency asked to read the book before you publish?
No, that's an interesting question. Well, now I don't work anymore for the federal government, so they couldn't do it as a measure of employment. And in fact, when I reached out, because I'd written the book about the Unabomber and the FBI thought I treated them fairly in that book, when I reached out to the FBI officially, as opposed to going through all my back channels and using my dad to get different sources and doing it source to source, in fact, I had to clear some people to talk to me through the FBI officially. They even went out so far as to put into their FBI bulletin one month that Lis is looking for people that know about Hanssen, and I got leads from that. So they helped me, which was pretty fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And the lead people that investigated Mike Rochford is probably the one, probably preeminently here in the book, admitted to me that mistakes were made, and he felt bad about them. And, but hindsight is always 20/20, and you're in that hunt, and you really think it could be the CIA guy, and, they should have let go of that sooner, but we're all here kind of judging what they did and didn't do. So, one of the nice reviews I got, well, I think they've all been nice, but from Publishers Weekly, I think it said that I didn't go the easy route and treat the FBI as dimwits, because they're not.
And you did show an incredible amount of work on their part.
Yes, yes, went with the wrong person initially,
I mean, yes.
but
yeah.
yes, yes.
But there was an incredible amount of work going on.
And collaboration, and of course, you all know Robert Mueller, you know, the Mueller report. So one of my favorite lines in here, and I won't swear because we're in a nice, there's swear words all through this book, because that's just what FBI agents do. But my main source, Mike Rochford, is telling the story to Bob Mueller. He's brought Bob Mueller in to brief him on what they're doing, and that it's Hanssen. He's telling the story about how he got this Russian asset, wined and dined him, did all this stuff, took him out on a yacht on 4th of July. I mean, it was really a lot of effort to flip this guy, because he was scared of the Russians, obviously. And the line in here where Mueller says to Rochford, he said, "That's the best fill-in-the-blank story I've ever heard in my life." And to hear Mueller say that, after the man that we know is, you know, doesn't say anything and, you know, is very composed, I just had to put that line in, because it was just like, that's an insight into Bob Mueller that we hadn't had before.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
You're welcome.